Today we get to talk about some specific classic strategy examples. These are all strategies that I actually had to live through. They span a period of about 20 to 25 years. I'm not going to tell you the programs that these were attached to or where they come from. Some of you might be able to guess. But we are going to go through several examples during the course of today's webinar and talk about good strategy and in some cases bad strategy. And yes, I have lived through bad strategy. Don't want to do it again, but sometimes you can't help it. So first of all, once again, we go through the 4 elements of the winning proposal. We'll be talking about the 4th element here, which is the compelling offer. Key to that is being able to demonstrate value you bring to the customer. The customer will have some kind of needs, and we will try to map that and show best value against those needs. And in doing so, we will have to adopt a strategy that will try to highlight those values and any discriminators we have that would set us up for the win, which is what we basically want. Strategy makes our offer compelling, right? So if we look up in the dictionary and ask ourselves, what does it say about strategy? They'll give you a standard definition, a plan, a method, a series of maneuvers or stratagems for obtaining a specific goal or result. So if that's what strategy is all about, then we have to define what is our goal. We're a competitor, and it's obvious that we want is a win out of this. So now we need to define what wins. And so what I like to define is what I call a winning end state. The winning end state is a condition that if it exists and the customer could be convinced that it does exist, i.e. it is real, it's not some promise, it's not some vague thing, but it's something that actually exists, the customer would actually be so enthralled with that offer that they would award us the job, probably cancel the competition, and just give us the contract, okay? That is what we would call the winning end state. And the strategy that you're going to adopt defines those maneuvers or stratagems that to achieve the winning end state. These are the things that you must do in order to achieve that winning end state. If we were low risk, we have to go through the proposal in every aspect and show how we're low risk. We could show low risk in technical, low risk in management, low risk in schedule, low risk in cost, low risk in all sorts of aspects of a proposal if that was the strategy that achieved the end state that we wanted. If we were low cost, then how can I achieve a low cost solution? How did I configure the technical? How did I configure the management to achieve that low cost solution? So today we're going to address several good and bad strategies, and like I said, all of these come from real competitions. So let's take a look at this. So we're going to have 3 examples of good strategy. The first one is called apart from the pack. This basically, you want to sit there and look at a competition, and if you see all of the competitors structured in one area, you may want to be apart from that, especially on a new start or a new opportunity early in the development cycle. Another good strategy is we're not those guys, which is basically when you're competing an incumbent, you're going to talk about all the things that the incumbent did and how they will continue to do that will lose in the competition, and then in the meantime convince the customer you're not those guys. A third good example of a strategy is no dogs in the fight. When we are what the customer asks for, if the customer asks for a specific trait or characteristic, we're going to sit there and talk to that. In this particular case, we're going to talk about an integrator job, and since we have no dogs in the fight, we can be the honest broker. And then we're going to go through 2 examples of bad strategy. Basically, you're trying to eliminate the competition, where you're going to try to kind of show the customer you're the best out of a field of 1, because if no one else can compete, then the customer's got to give you the competition. Hardly ever works, by the way. And then another one I've seen a lot of is reuse means low risk, where a competitor will try to use reuse hardware, software, whatever it is, in order to sit there and demonstrate that they are low risk, and sometimes this ends up to be a bridge too far if you take it to an extreme, as one of the cases we'll talk about today. So apart from the pack, basically, like I said, this is an early development program. Could be during the study phase, ahead of the milestone A, or a technology development phase, which is ahead of the milestone B, which gives you plenty of time to mature your solution, okay? Oftentimes there's going to be an incumbent, they're going to be married to their solution, and it's kind of hard to move off that solution when you've said that this was the best answer all along, right? If you've been building stuff for this customer for a long time, you're going to try to convince them that this is best, and that a simple modification would be the best answer for them. Multiple competitors are also vying for a role in this major program because, after all, these major programs are what end up to be the major money makers for any kind of competitor. And of course, some of these competitors will be clustered around the incumbent solution, right? It's hard to think out of the box. If you're the outsider and you're trying to unseat that incumbent as well as everybody else, you may never have worked this mission before, so you have no preferred answer, right? You can explore the trade space with whatever you want. You may never have worked with this customer before and you have no track record, but remember, you're early on and you've got potentially 1, 2, or even maybe 3 phases of the program before we get down to a production phase, and therefore you can convince the customer and develop that track record that you're the right pick. So you look at this situation and you decide that being apart from the pack is the right strategy, and therefore you can configure your solution consistent with that. So what you want to do is you want to pick a parameter, something that sets you apart. You want to separate yourself from the pack, and so one of the easy ways to do this graphically as an example, and just kind of illustrate what we're talking about, is to define 2 axes that characterize the competition. Those axes should be based on the customer's most important requirements. If they're worried about sustaining operations, then maybe risk is important. If they're worried about cost, then maybe LCC is important. And if they're worried about performance, maybe the best KPP would be a very important thing to consider. So what you want to do is pick 2 axes and then plot positions of you and your competitors, and then determine whether or not there's sufficient separation. If there is not sufficient separation, you may want to choose another parameter. And then you want to demonstrate you are different with a plan to mature, right? Once again, we set up these conditions so that this is a strategy that you can adopt if you have time to mature your answer. And then you have to ask yourself continually, constantly assessing your strategy, will the customer accept the risk for a high payoff? You have to look at what the customer's reactions are and determine if they're worried about something else. And what they say and what they really mean might be 2 different things. So you have to constantly gauge the customer's reactions. So rather than telling them all the good answers, we're going to listen for the reaction. And then, of course, potentially move your offer as the competition progresses. Since you're not wedded to any one solution, change is easy for you. So how does this pay off in terms of the graphic that you may want to create for yourself as you demonstrate your strategy? Like I said, pick the 2 axes that set you apart. In this case, we've chosen risk and system effectiveness. Perhaps there was a KPP, that key performance parameter, that the customer says this is really important, and in that parameter they have set threshold and objective levels of performance. So you're given the opportunity to select between threshold and objective. By the way, going over objective usually does not give you any extra credit, so doing that is not really the best thing to do. So in this particular case, you've chosen these 2 things. Now you plot your competitors. A, B, and C are the competitor. Maybe A is the incumbent. B and C are people that are clustered around the competitor because they're following basically the same line of a solution that the competitor or the incumbent already has. And then you're D, but you're out there with potentially a high payoff solution, but it's also a little bit risky. And so you sit there and plot your position and you determine whether or not there are sufficient separation. In this case, we see that there's separation in both axes, risk and system effectiveness. So our objective now is got to be able to sit there and say, how do we reduce this risk? So you have to sit there and mitigate that parameter. In this case, it happens to be risk. And at the end of this 2 or potentially 3-phase competition, when the customer is deciding who wins the 4th phase or the production phase, LRIP and full rate production, you want to have demonstrated over time that you've moved your risk position down to low risk, and now the answer is relatively easy for the customer. All along, they're going to keep you because you're the high payoff, while picking A, B, or C is more of the same. We are not those guys. So here is a strategy where you're playing against an incumbent. And typically incumbents lose, so this is ripe strategy for a lot of people that are breaking in to an area where they've never competed with before. Usually the incumbent has had past problems. These may be very serious. They're well known to the customer. And so the customer begins with a series of studies when they're looking to compete this follow-on system. They're searching for alternatives that solve their problems. That's what they say. They say, and when you go through these problems, you're looking to see what are the problems so that you can sit there and develop your strategy and point out how you're going to improve things. Does their performance fail to meet the emerging needs? After all, the threat continually evolves. The system solutions have got to respond to these threats, and maybe the system that they've got has got a dead end, and it can't meet all the performance. Did the incumbent fail to manage on the current contract? So maybe it was a management problem that caused all these problems. Or maybe there's a new way of doing business that will enhance the performance. Maybe they should have bought more stuff. Maybe they picked the wrong subcontractor. So you offer a variety of solutions to these problems. You're the competitor from the outside that is trying to beat the incumbent. You're going to offer up all the trades and analyses and explore that trade space because the customer is searching for those alternatives. And you're going to look at it in all different ways, while the incumbent typically is focused on their problems and on their areas and on their solutions. And they usually don't support these kinds of trades because, after all, they already have the right answer, and it's a simple extension of what they produced all along. So now the customer goes through and releases a technology development RFP. Their biggest concern is continuity of service. So these studies have now focused the customer's thinking, and they have now come down and said, hey, continuity of service is a major issue for us. And our second priority is avoiding the problems that they've had. Both of these indicate that there is a viable source, a second source may be considered, but you have to address the continuity of service issue that they are talking about. So you continue to assess the opportunity. Like I said, always assess your strategy. Is the customer responding favorably to it? If not, then maybe it's time to change. In this particular case, we're worried about whether or not the customer is really looking for an alternative or whether or not they just want a stalking horse to whip the incumbent into shape. So do they level the playing field in this particular case? Are they sharing all the details of the current system so you get insight to what is and is not very good? Do they open up the second-tier contractors? After all, that incumbent has had a relationship, and often those relationships with subcontractors are for critical parts of the system. Does the customer say, hey, you second-tier contractors, you've got to be able to support all comers with commodity buys, so they can't be exclusive to the incumbent. Another indication that the customer is willing to open up. You're always looking for these clues. Your biggest risk, since you're the outsider, is the system transition. You have to attack the technical risk mitigation. One way to do this is buy the critical subsystems and components from the incumbent vendors. Then you don't have to develop it yourself. You also look at novel methods to avoid risk. As an example, if you've already solved a lot of the technical risk, maybe it's the integration risk that you have to sit there and address. So you look up ways such as perhaps developing a pathfinder, building a pathfinder, and running it through the integration cycle to prove that you can sit there and put all these subsystems and components together. You also, to address the transition, you work off-ramps and alternatives to mitigate the consequence of a gap. If for suddenly some reason the existing system fails to operate for whatever reason, you have to be able to step up and provide a gap filler capacity or capability if that's required. And then you configure your system solution to achieve the cost goals. After all, the customer is worried about cost, and of course you can sit there and introduce some new technology, provide better performance at reduced costs. Now, is this enough to swing things your way? You've demonstrated the ability to follow directions. You explored where the incumbent would not. You're open to all the alternatives. You gave them the positives and negatives for each of these alternatives. You've looked at management issues, technical issues, and cost considerations this way and that. You supported the competition in every way, while the incumbent is trying to push more of the same solution that they've been providing for whatever long they've been in this business. Your response shows a good understanding of the problems. You've discussed the contingency as addressing those service continuity problems, and you also point out that the incumbent has to address this too. The same problems that would cause the current system to fail and then would be present with the incumbent or an alternative contractor. And of course, then you provide a competitive solution. The customer now has a decision that narrows to a very simple choice. I know what I get if I stay with the incumbent, which is more of the same, and perhaps the risk of a new contractor is the better choice. So once again, you've played this risk game both for yourself and against the incumbent. You try to mitigate the risks associated with picking a new vendor, and you've also pointed out the risks that the incumbent has in trying to do what they say. So you've really given the customer, put them on the horns of a dilemma, and oftentimes you will be able to successful in this endeavor as you unseat the incumbent. It's happened many, many times. No dogs in the fight. This is a very interesting strategy, and this is a response to a certain characteristic that the customer is asking for. So the customer in this particular case may be facing a system that's growing in complexity. Look at some of these programs out there. These are huge programs. Fleet Ballistic Missile Program is a huge program. F-35 is a huge program. Armored vehicles in the Army is a huge program because they buy many, many, many of them. So lots of money is tied up in these large systems, and they're interconnected oftentimes around the globe. And so you need to have an upgrade to a system. It makes a very critical upgrade or a critical investment. So when they look at these investments and how they're going to do it, they look at a system and they say, do I want to piecewise replace this system, or do I want to sit there and hire somebody to go off and replace the entire thing? So in any case like this, the question comes down to the customer, who does systems integration? These large systems have to be put together, and traditionally the government has done that in many of those cases. Fleet Ballistic Missile submarines are put together, the whole system, buying the missiles, buying the submarines, buying all the supporting elements of it, is really managed by the Navy themselves. In other cases, the government will hire a dedicated systems engineering and integration contractor. And one of the best examples of an SE&I is in the old Star Wars days when the SDIO hired General Electric to do the SE&I of the Star Wars system when they were integrating all those various elements. Star Wars was a classic example of systems of systems. And then sometimes the contractor is hired as a systems integrator as an alternative. And if there's not enough time to run separate competitions, after all, you want your SE&I in place before you start figuring out how you're going to buy all the elements of the system. But if that's not going to sit there and support you, then you're going to have to sit there and decide maybe what I need to just hire a systems integrator and start with a multi-phase program in the definition phase and explore how each competitor would perform those SE&I tasks. So here we have in a case the customer says, I want to hire a systems integrator. So here's a characteristic, and you're going to sit there and tell the customer exactly what you think a systems integrator should be. So define what it is. They focus on system engineering tasks. You list all those tasks that have to be done. These are critical things that must be accomplished by a systems engineer. So you focus on all that. You focus on the systems integration tasks. And typically both of these are something that a prime contractor would do anyway. But the third element you point out here is something that's unique to a systems integrator. Because unlike a prime contractor who oftentimes builds lots of the stuff themselves and still does the systems engineering and integration tasks, a systems integrator, a true systems integrator, has to be the honest broker for the customer. This is where you get no dogs in the fight. Because here is where you want to start out by picking the best solutions regardless of the source. And if you are the honest broker with no dogs in the fight, you're really the guy that can do that. So you turn around, you demonstrate how well you meet those criteria once you define what they are. You talk about the systems engineering methods and tools, and you show the results of it. You show you got those tools and that you can sit there and actually do what you're saying. You describe what each element of the system and how you buy it and how you integrate it, and what you tell it, the customer, is that everybody will compete for a role when you're the only game in town. And a company with no dogs in the fight is the only honest broker. Any company that has a material solution will favor that answer. After all, that's money in their own pocket that they would be giving away if they hired a subcontractor. The customer is faced with an easy choice. You describe your SE&I tasks and how they're accomplished. Everybody else shows pretty pictures of their favorite solution, because if everybody else has got a solution, that's what they're going to want to advertise in the proposal. You describe how the customer objectives are met, while everybody else tries to convince them that their solution is the best one in the world. You describe your team of one with no dogs in the fight. Your competitors will describe how their traditional contractors and subcontractors are exclusive to them and are unable to support anybody else. Well, that's not going to be true once the competition is settled. You describe how you can get all the contractors to play along after you're declared the winner. And they, on the other hand, are telling the customer that the other contractors are not required because we can do it all in-house. You discuss the customer's role in subcontracting decisions, while the competitors don't need any help in determining who's best. And so in this particular case, when you compare and contrast the two offers or the three offers or the four offers, even if all the evaluations are equivalent, the scores are all equivalent, the source selection authority is going to look at this and say, who is really going to give me best value here? If I pick anybody with material solution, that material solution is going to be part of the answer. Whereas if I pick the SE&I, even if that is the best material solution, I can influence the SE&I to go buy that material solution from that subcontractor once the SE&I is won. So here's a case where no dogs in the fight really helps you win. So let's transition to bad strategy. Nobody wants to be on a bad strategy, but nothing like losing a major competition to help train you what it feels like and how you never want to experience again. So here's a customer who wants the next generation system development. Their idea is they want to use technology to drive performance up, but cost down. So they have made significant technology investments to achieve those goals. So oftentimes customers will go to these tech houses and pay lots of money to develop all sorts of technology, whether it's batteries, propellants, whatever it is. There's these tech houses that are sitting there building all this stuff. The current system limitations are well known, and the customer asserts that only through technology can the objectives be met. So customer initiates a study phase to replace the system. Many contractors participate to share the state of the art. Customer gives contracts to prime contractors. They also give contracts to major subcontractors who will build major components of the existing system and some who don't. They also give contracts to the technology developers in the interest of gathering what is the real state of the art, what is the art of the possible, what can the customer really do. And these results will then shape the customer requirements for the milestone A. So coming out of the milestone A, they've got the CDD and the requirements that are in that favor certain capabilities based on the available technology. So after going through all of that and deciding on what they view as really important and the capabilities they want, they initiate a technology development phase, and you decide to corner the market as a competitor on all those technologies. So your solution is the only viable answer is a strategy that you're trying to adopt. You execute exclusive teaming arrangements. You pick up another prime contractor to spread the risk, right? No sense competing against people if they're willing to join your team for a piece of the pie. It's a big job, so why not? Sharing in some cases is a better answer than going at it alone. You pick up all your favorite subcontractors and even those of the other prime for all the subsystems, and then you go gather all those technology companies together and offer them exclusive teaming arrangements to come with you. You might even figure that a joint venture is the best way to spread the risk. And because major competitions are always expensive, and so by asking everybody to contribute to the joint venture, you've spread the risk around and the expense around. The problem with your answers is that your solutions always features a, quote, best of the team. If teammate A provides widgets, there's always going to be a widget in your answer. If teammate A offers gnomes, there's always going to be one of them in there. And if teammate C favors stuff, there's always going to be stuff in there. And this is the problem. If you committed to give teammate A, B, and C all work, then what they do has got to be part of the answer. You cannot leave teammate B out, or they're going to be screaming bloody murder and pointing to their teaming agreement. So you're kind of stuck. Your solutions always will feature this. And so, but your strategy says, how can we lose since we have the only viable answer? Since I negotiated all these exclusive teaming agreements, nobody else can offer the technology. No one else can offer the subsystems. I can even go out there and attempt to prove to the customer that No one else can even do this job. Why are you holding a competition? So, moving out on that answer, you all of a sudden discover that your nightmare is only just beginning. Your competitor will go complain to the customer. If I was the competitor and I was consulting to them, I would be in front of the customer and telling them your incumbent or your other competitor is making things unavailable to us. You spent all this money on the expensive technology, Mr. Customer, but now it's unavailable to us. How can you get best value in that situation? So the customer turns around and tells the tech providers, you will support all players. It doesn't necessarily violate their teaming agreement, since they usually provide only what the merchant, a merchant's provider would provide. They don't provide real support, but it really sends a message to the tech providers that you could be losing here because your role on this other team may be very small compared to what you got on the competitor you're representing. Those subsystems were paid per you, Mr. Customer, on the XYZ program. You must act to make sure that those things are provided as well. But you, as a competitor, you continue on because you're so cocky you feel that those guys really don't get it, right? Even with all that limited help, they can't possibly compete. The true secret sauce is not going to be provided by those guys. They're just going to be merchant suppliers. The customer needs a stalking horse, so let them be. You fail to understand the magnitude of the problem. Once again, you have not revisited your strategy to see if it's really working. Your strategy was saying, hey, nobody can compete against us, and all of a sudden now there is somebody competing against us. You failed to You're limited in your response because your solution is limited by your teaming. The customer evaluation shows the weakness of your offer. Who is really in charge of that joint venture? There's little or no resources to a joint venture, and it can be vacated easily. And so who is really in charge? Why does your solution always spread the money around? There's the same cast of characters, and I can't believe that that's best value. So as a result, you've actually walked yourself into a corner where actually somebody can be competitive against you and have the customer bust open all those teaming agreements and possibly come up with a better solution because they're not encumbered by all of those teaming arrangements, forces you to give a share to all those people. And as a result, they may be more competitive and in many cases will be. The last one we're going to look at is reuse. Reuse means low risk. Well, sometimes reuse can be low risk, but if you take it to an extreme, you're going to lock yourself into a corner. The customer plans on replacing a current system. They focus on risk throughout the pre-RFP phase. They tell you the proposal risk is going to be a separate evaluation factor. Oftentimes it is included in the mission capability factor, but sometimes it's broken out. And once it's broken out, its relative importance among factors is much greater. There is a major topic on program risks and mitigation in Section L. You are forced to talk about your program risks and how you're going to mitigate them, and you're going to be evaluated against that. Oh, by the way, if you tell the customer you have no risks, they may view that as pretty risky in the proposal risk evaluation. Then the cost price factor contains the most probable cost criteria, which in fact is a double whammy because if the customer comes back and says, you missed some proposal risk here, they could update up your cost because of that most probable cost criteria. And that indeed is what they often do. They also focus on cost throughout the pre-RFP phase. The cost price contains an evaluation of both the instant contract and lifecycle cost. So the instant contract is probably the first phase, maybe even get you through the LRIP, but usually they don't contract for the firm fixed price or outlying years because it goes outside the contracting window. But they do want an assessment, and so you have to consider the operations and sustainment costs as part of your life cycle costs. If you offer up something that is very expensive to maintain, then that is going to weigh heavily against your life cycle costs. They also keep stressing that the current system is too expensive to run, too expensive to buy, and so they're looking for a combination of risk reduction and cost reduction. And so you respond to that by saying, hey, reuse of hardware and software is the right answer, because if I reuse existing stuff, then that must be lower risk, and if I reuse existing stuff, that must be lower cost. So your strategy seems obvious to you, and you configure your offer accordingly. And you maximize reuse in all parts of the solution because you're going to sit there and say, more reuse means lower risk. You architect a solution based on that risk, but unfortunately, you lack the flexibility to configure a winning architecture. Remember, we're talking about a system here, and you've got to come up with an architecture. And the architecture may have various components to it. And if you are forced to reuse elements within that architecture, you may not be free to set up something that is different. And therefore, the other guy has more, is free to choose a more optimal solution where you're locked into reuse. Your system performance suffers due to old technology. If you're reusing a technology, you are going to have a difficult time cramming sufficient performance to meet threshold. The other guy can offer better performance, which yields margin, because they'll just not do reuse. They'll say it's new stuff and it gets better performance. Your design ends up being heavier and requires more power to operate. Why? Well, because it limits your reuse existing design. You're stuck with whatever weight and power they consume. The other guy has no restrictions. He can sit there and offer significant weight and power reduction through technology. You claim you're low risk because reuse avoids design issues, and then you point to your own history as a reference. I mean, it's difficult for you to go off to the competitor and say, oh, their reuse was a failure. It's easier for you to do that, and so you point to the areas where you have good references of reuse. The other guy accepts the risk and provides the mitigation plans. You can claim low cost price because reuse avoids cost. And then you use government models proving you are low cost, and the other guy is forced to bid what they offer. So you basically locked into this strategy based on the idea that you're doing reuse. Now, during the late stages of the proposal development, you discovered that your offer is a loser. You are losing at the architecture level. You are forced into a structure based on reusing existing designs that are heavier and use more power and have less performance. As a result of that, you have to put more of them out there in order to achieve the same level of performance, and therefore you have a higher life cycle cost due to this compromise. You lose at the performance level because you're losing inefficient old technology. You meet threshold performance, but with very little margin, which doesn't give you a lot of room to maneuver as you develop the system. As a result, you lose at the design level because when you go through the design, everybody expects that things are going to get heavier and they're going to consume more power. But unforeseen problems could also crop up, and therefore you're going to have little margin in which to deal with those things as they crop up, which means that your performance may be impacted. But you're already in a position where you're at threshold, and any reduction in performance will mean that you failed to meet threshold. Now the customer is looking at you with this double whammy of risk and saying, any slip in this performance is unacceptable, and therefore you're assessed a higher risk because of this consequence of failure. Any change in your system could be potentially disastrous for this customer. Finally, you lose at the cost price level because what did the customer do? After they assessed that risk, they said, this is what you're going to have to do to address the risk, and the only way you can do that is by going on a diet or reducing power or something to make up the shortfall of performance. As a result, they end up adding to your cost through the most probable cost adjustment clause, and you end up with a higher evaluated cost than the other guy. Real world case, shocker, but it's true. So in conclusion, I'd like to say, first of all, when you're developing your strategy, consider carefully. When you define your winning end state, does it really appeal to the customer? The first thing I find out with customers is they typically will settle on a winning end state that talks about what they are or what they have been. That's not a winning end state. It's not where you are or where you think you are. It's where you want to be when you finish this job. And therefore, states of being like I'm the biggest, I'm the smallest, I'm the only, or the whatever typically don't carry the day in a strategy. So consider your winning end state carefully. And then finally, the second thing is that does your strategy get you there? If your winning end state says I need to invest a ton of money in order to do all this work, does your strategy and the support from management to that strategy get you there? If you don't get there, then your probability to win goes down. After all, we said the winning end state would be the hands down winner. Any back off in that position could impact your probability to win. So do you have the series of steps to accomplish things on time? If you got to do it in time, you got to make sure that you've got those steps accomplished prior to when you need them. You got to focus on the value of your offer to the customer. Look at what they really value, and that may change over time. Remember, early on in any kind of development program, there's a storming and forming, and the customer is really looking at what the art of the possible is and what those capabilities could be. And as they go through, they may start changing what they term as really valuable to them. And the second item in there is, do you discriminate against your competition? You want to position yourself apart from the other guys. As an example, one of the ways to do that we saw was apart from the pack. If you discriminate yourself in that fashion, you've really set yourself apart. But remember, discriminators only count when they're valued by the customer. So make sure that they value that. Write your proposal to reflect your strategy. Each section should reinforce some strategy element. The problem I find is that oftentimes we'll go in and red team a proposal. They'll tell us, well, here was our strategy. We'll review the proposal and ask, where's your strategy? I don't see what it is. It hasn't been broken apart, because usually it's a series of lofty statements and that you want to achieve. Those strategisms and tasks that achieve the strategy are the things that you got to be talking about. And if you haven't decomposed that strategy into those things that make your strategy real and then talk about them in the proposal, you have not really provided a compelling reason for why the customer ought to pick you. And after all, the fourth element of the winning proposal is demonstrating you have a compelling story, and the strategy and the discriminators are key to that. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Joe, if Joe's still there.
Yep, I sure am. Got a couple questions, and I'll go ahead and ask them. First one is, under setting yourself apart, can you assume that one KPP is more important than the other based on the number of pages devoted to it in either the SAO or PWS?
Well, KPPs are tough, and of course, they'll usually put a KPP in a numeric order. In other words, KPP 1 will be the most important, KPP 2 will be the second most important. And remember, in this exercise, is one of the things you got to do is, when you make these decisions, is you got to A, listen to what the customer's saying, and B, understand what they really mean, okay? So you got to go through and dissect that stuff and see what they're really saying and what they really mean behind this stuff. And then don't forget that there's also key system attributes. So in relative importance, when you look at a requirements document, you have KPPs, KSAs, and then just regular requirements. And indeed, I've seen customers go through and prioritize requirements in Group A, Group B, Group C. So once again, you're getting a pretty clear indication of what's most important from the requirement side. A little more difficult on the programmatic side, management, schedule, risk, those things you have to sit there and delve with a little bit deeper. That's where you're going to sit there and get more customer information and gather as much as you can in order to make a determination. But usually, as part of your strategy development, you're going to go through and pull all this information together and try to coalesce onto a set of 2, maybe 3, potentially even 4 items that are the most important requirements. Much more than that, and you haven't really focused on the major ones. But you'll find them and then test them. During the course of the proposal, and these phases that you're executing contracts, waiting for the next competitive phase to start up, test your analysis and see if the customer agrees with you. And there's all sorts of ways to do that. I hope that answers your question.
Great. This one is from Brandy in Virginia, under We Are Not Those Guys, and I like the way this is turned. If you are the incumbent, what is a good strategy to acknowledge previous program problems?
That is a very, very good question. It's a very difficult question. I've been in that problem space before and have won as an incumbent. What you have to do is, once again, you have to seriously consider what is important to the customer. And if your knowledge and understanding of the system is critical, then you have to get that into the competition somehow. In every situation, it will be different, but once again, my recommendation, if you're the incumbent and you're competing against somebody and you want to preserve your position, I would hire some outside consultants, because I already view you as contaminated. I think you've been living with this whole problem for many years, and if you're the incumbent, you ain't going to even recognize what the customer really wants because you're so steeped in your own answer. I would get some outside help. I would get some fresh thinking. I would pull it in and see what you can come up with from the outside, and then drive towards that. But every situation is unique. So that is one of the most difficult competitions you can be in. Having been in them and worked them long term, they're very difficult. Requires a lot of work, a lot of strategy work.
All right.
I know that is an answer,
but this one's from Brian. And it was under the slide 16. How can you make tech providers more responsive even after the customer tells them, but they tend to slow roll it?
Well, that's always the problem you're going to face. And there's a couple of ways. I mean, obviously, confronting them head on, you know, at a management level is the first thing you want to do. The other thing to do, of course, is get access to all the reports and all the work they've done. You know, so go visit the customers. Usually in the customer houses, the technology development people are different from the systems people, and so you can go to the technology development houses in the customer shop and ask them for help, ask them for the reports, ask them. You know, if you have to sign some kind of NDA agreement, you might even have to separate people to get access to that. But typically, you'll be surprised you don't need as much information as you can. The other thing to do is when you enter into an informal agreement with these guys, document everything. Document everything. If only because when you do win and that technology provider comes crawling back to you because you're the only game in town, you can play with them with hardball, or these are the guys that were good to us and we'll be nice to them. I also find that in a teaming arrangement, since you are not encumbered by all those things, you could actually offer a better deal sometimes to these technology developers. Move them up a leg on the integration. You know, if they're providing a part, tell them you'll let them develop a unit. If they're developing a unit, tell them you'll let them develop a subsystem. Sometimes it's if they get a better offer from somebody, they will consider breaking the teaming agreement and then blame the customer for the reason why they had to break it. Doesn't sound like a bad idea. But those are the ways that I go about doing it, and I know it's tough. I've been thrown out of places like that because they won't support me. So it's a tough job.
Yeah, it sure is. That's all the questions we actually had today, so I'd like to thank everybody for attending today's webinar for the win. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. My name was on the invitation, or email Jim. His email is listed right there. So thanks everyone for your time. I hope you have a great day and a pleasant weekend. So long, everyone.